August 6, 1983, Gun Barrel City, Texas. That summer evening, a Dallas firefighter named Jimmy Don Beets vanished without a trace. His boat was found drifting on Lake Athens. Inside were his fishing rod and tackle box, as if he had simply stepped away. Search teams combed the lake for days. Divers scoured the depths. Helicopters hovered overhead. Everyone assumed he had drowned. Weeks passed. Then months. Jimmy Don's body never surfaced. His family grieved without answers. His neighbors whispered theories, and his disappearance settled into the uneasy quiet of a small Texas town that had lost one of its own. 2 years later, the silence was shattered. In June 1985, investigators armed with a search warrant arrived at the modest home of his wife, Betty Lou Beets. Acting on a tip from her daughter, they dug beneath a decorative wishing well in the front yard. What they unearthed turned the missing person case into a nightmare. There, hidden beneath flowers and soil, were the skeletal remains of Jimmy Don. And then came an even darker discovery. In the backyard, wrapped in a sleeping bag, lay another body. Doyle Wayne Barker, Betty's fourth husband, who had vanished years earlier. 2 men, 2 husbands, both dead, both buried on the same property. This was no accident. And soon Betty Lou Beets, a grandmother, a mother of 5, a woman with a long history of abuse and broken marriages, would stand accused of capital murder. Her case would become one of the most sensational in Texas history, raising questions about guilt, trauma, and justice that still divide people today. This is the story of Betty Lou Beets. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss the next case that forces us to rethink what justice really means. Betty Lou Beets was born on March 12, 1937, in Roxborough, North Carolina. She came into the world during the shadow of the Great Depression, in a region where poverty was common and opportunity was rare. Her childhood was marked by hardship. At age 3, she contracted measles that left her partially deaf, isolating her from her peers and complicating her education. Struggling to keep up, she dropped out of school after the 6th grade, but the difficulties at home were even greater. According to later accounts, Betty grew up in an abusive household where neglect and sexual abuse allegedly scarred her early years. This trauma, her advocates argued, set the stage for the relationships and choices that would define her adult life. As a teenager, Betty married for the first time. It was the beginning of a pattern that would repeat again and again. Over the years, she married 6 times, including common-law unions, and gave birth to 5 children. Her marriages were turbulent. Several were reportedly violent, marred by alcoholism, arguments, and physical abuse. One husband allegedly beat her severely. Another left her destitute. In each case, Betty seemed to move from one unstable situation to another, searching for security but finding only more pain. Her children grew up in this environment of chaos. Some later testified about fights in the home, sudden disappearances, and their mother's desperate attempts to keep food on the table. They described a childhood overshadowed by instability, poverty, and fear. Alongside these struggles, Betty dealt with health challenges. She lived with partial deafness, and doctors later suggested she had suffered brain damage from illness and trauma. Combined with limited education, these conditions left her with few opportunities and even fewer resources. By the early 1980s, Betty's life had become a cycle of poverty, abusive relationships, and survival. Yet in courtrooms and news reports years later, much of this context was stripped away. The jury would hear about 2 men buried in her yard, but they would not fully hear about the battered child, the abused wife, or the desperate mother behind the crimes. To the prosecution, Betty Lou Beets was a calculating black widow. To her defenders, she was a deeply broken woman, shaped by trauma that the justice system ignored. It was this collision of narratives, predator versus survivor, that made her case so haunting and so difficult to define. The 1985 search of Betty's property changed everything. What began as a missing person investigation became a tale of hidden graves, family secrets, and accusations of murder. Forensic experts confirmed that both Jimmy Don Beets and Doyle Wayne Barker had been killed by gunshot wounds from a .38 caliber handgun. Police tied that weapon to Betty. But what shocked investigators most wasn't just the deaths, it was the way the bodies were concealed. Jimmy Don's body was buried beneath a decorative wishing well, placed in the front yard where neighbors passed by daily. Flowers grew above it. Children may have played near it. It was hiding in plain sight, a symbol of ordinary domestic life covering extraordinary horror. In the backyard, Doyle's body was found wrapped in a sleeping bag and buried in the earth. His disappearance in 1981 had gone largely unnoticed, but the grave told its own story. To investigators, these weren't the acts of a desperate woman. They were the acts of someone who planned, who hid, who carried on as if nothing had happened. Then came the testimony that would devastate Betty's defense. Her son, Robert "Robbie" Branson, said Betty had enlisted him to help bury Jimmy Don after she shot him. Another son, Jamie, testified that he helped dispose of Doyle's body years earlier. And her daughter, Shirley, told investigators that Betty had confessed to killing Jimmy Don, describing how she pulled the trigger. The prosecution built a narrative of greed and cold calculation. Jimmy Don was worth far more dead than alive, nearly $100,000 in life insurance and pension benefits. They argued Betty shot him in his sleep, motivated not by fear, but by money. 2 bodies, 2 children involved in cover-ups, a confession to a daughter. To the state, the story was clear. Betty Lou Beets was a black widow who preyed on her husbands, but Betty's defense argued otherwise. They painted her as a woman living under constant abuse, trapped in marriages that turned violent, her children witnesses to chaos and fear. They said her children's testimony was shaped by confusion, fear, or pressure, not truth. They claimed Betty's actions were not premeditation, but the desperate responses of a battered woman who had reached her breaking point. The truth was murky, the emotions raw, and soon these competing narratives would be put to the test before a jury. In June 1985, days after the discovery of the bodies, Betty Lou Beets was arrested and charged with capital murder in the death of Jimmy Don. Although Doyle Barker's remains had been found, prosecutors chose not to pursue that case. They believed the evidence surrounding Jimmy Don's murder, the insurance money, the testimony, the concealed grave, was strong enough on its own. Her trial later that year was one of the most sensational in Henderson County history. The prosecution's case was stark and powerful. They portrayed Betty as manipulative, calculating, and motivated by greed. They told jurors she shot Jimmy Don as he slept, then coldly buried him in her yard, decorating the grave with a wishing well. They pointed to the insurance money as motive and to the testimony of her own children as damning evidence. The defense, meanwhile, argued that Betty was a victim of abuse, shaped by trauma, unable to see a way out. They said she lived in fear, not calculation. They tried to frame her actions within the cycle of domestic violence. But crucial details never reached the jury. Her history of childhood abuse, her hearing impairment, her brain damage, the repeated violence in her marriages, none of this was presented in depth. Instead, jurors were left with the image of a hidden grave, the testimony of her children, and the suggestion of a financial motive. When deliberations ended, the jury returned with a unanimous verdict. Guilty of capital murder. The sentence, death. With that, Betty Lou Beets was sent to death row at the Mountain View unit in Gatesville, Texas. But her story and the battle over her life was far from over. When the jury sentenced Betty Lou Beets to death in 1985, her fight for survival shifted from the courtroom to the appellate system. For the next 15 years, her life would be defined by legal battles, shifting arguments, and international campaigns to save her. At the heart of her appeals was the claim of ineffective assistance of counsel. Under American law, every defendant is entitled not only to a lawyer, but to a lawyer who provides competent representation. Betty's attorneys argued that her trial lawyer, E. Ray Andrews, had failed her in devastating ways. First, Andrews had allegedly negotiated media rights to her life story, a clear conflict of interest. Instead of focusing solely on her defense, critics said he had a financial stake in the drama surrounding her trial. That raised troubling questions. Was Betty a client, or was she a story? Second, and more importantly, Andrews had failed to present mitigating evidence. Evidence that could have influenced the jury to spare her life. This included her history of childhood abuse, claims of sexual assault by her father, the brain damage she allegedly suffered, her hearing impairment, and the years of documented domestic violence in her marriages. None of this was fully explained to the jury. Instead, jurors were asked to decide her fate with only the prosecution's stark narrative before them. A manipulative woman who killed for money. Betty's post-conviction lawyers argued that if jurors had known the full story, the depth of her trauma, the effects of abuse, the possibility that she suffered from battered woman syndrome, at least one of them might have chosen life imprisonment instead of death. In 1991, there was a moment of hope. A federal district judge ruled in her favor, agreeing that her trial representation had been inadequate. For a brief time, it looked as if Betty might be granted a new trial, or at least a new sentencing hearing. But that relief was short-lived. On appeal, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals overturned the ruling. They didn't dispute the failings of her lawyer. They focused instead on procedural barriers. Her lawyers, they said, had failed to properly raise these claims in earlier appeals. And in death penalty law, procedure can matter as much as substance. Because her claims were defaulted, she was barred from relief. This was a turning point. It meant that even when judges acknowledged flaws in her trial, those flaws didn't matter if her lawyers had missed a deadline or filed the wrong motion at the wrong time. Her attorneys carried the fight to the U.S. Supreme Court, arguing that Betty was facing death without ever having her mitigating evidence heard. In 1999, the court declined to intervene. With that, her last judicial avenue closed. But while the courts turned her away, her case was gaining international attention. Amnesty International issued urgent appeals, calling her execution a violation of human rights. The United Nations weighed in, asking Texas to reconsider. Editorial boards at the Washington Post and the other national outlets criticized the lack of fairness in her trial. Supporters pointed to her history of abuse and argued that executing Betty would send a chilling message, that a woman scarred by violence could be condemned to die without her story ever being fully heard. The decision ultimately fell to the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles and to Governor George W. Bush, who at the time was preparing a run for the presidency. They both rejected her petitions. No clemency would come. By the end of 1999, Betty Lou Beets had exhausted every option. The state of Texas set a date for her execution, February 24, 2000. On a cold Thursday evening in Huntsville, Texas, the story of Betty Lou Beets reached its final chapter. The Huntsville unit, nicknamed The Walls, has long been the site of Texas executions. Its walls have held hundreds of men and women in their last hours, and on February 24, 2000, it prepared to hold Betty. She was 62 years old, a grandmother, frail, soft-spoken, and far removed from the woman who had once been at the center of a sensational trial. Outside the prison, crowds gathered. Protesters stood with candles and signs chanting for mercy. Some carried placards with slogans about battered women, pointing out that Betty's life story had never been heard in full. Others came to support the execution, holding pictures of Jimmy Don Beets and demanding justice for the firefighter whose life had been cut short. Reporters lined the sidewalks, broadcasting live to a world eager to watch. Betty's case had become not just a Texas story, but an international one. Inside the prison, the atmosphere was stark and clinical. Betty was offered the tradition of a final meal, but she declined. She also declined to make a final statement. Witnesses later said she appeared calm, even resigned, as she was led to the gurney and secured by leather straps. At 6:18 p.m., the executioner injected the lethal chemicals into her veins. Within minutes, her breathing slowed, her body stilled, and the attending physician pronounced her dead. Betty Lou Beets became the second woman executed in Texas since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. Only Carla Faye Tucker, executed in 1998, had come before her. Nationwide, she was one of fewer than 20 women executed in the modern era. The rarity of her execution made headlines around the world. For some, it was proof that justice applied equally, regardless of gender. For others, it was proof that the justice system had failed to account for the complexities of her life. For Jimmy Don's family, the execution brought a measure of closure, but not peace. For Betty's children, it was another wound. They had lived through abuse, testified against their mother, and now watched as the state ended her life. When the crowd outside finally dispersed, the questions remain. Was this justice? Or was it simply another tragedy in a life already defined by pain? Even as Betty's body was buried, the debates she sparked continued. Her case did not end with her death. It lived on as a symbol, a cautionary tale, and a challenge to the way America thinks about capital punishment. The first unresolved issue is mitigation. The jury that sentenced Betty never heard about her childhood sexual abuse, her brain damage, her hearing impairment, or the long history of violence in her marriages. Advocates argue that this information was essential, not to excuse her crimes, but to explain them. In death penalty cases, mitigating evidence can make the difference between life and death. Without it, can a verdict truly be fair? The second issue is the two bodies in her yard. For prosecutors, they proved a pattern. Not self-defense, but premeditated murder. For critics, the presence of Doyle Barker's body raised questions the state never answered. Why wasn't she prosecuted for his death? Was it because the evidence was weaker, or because focusing on Jimmy Don's case was strategically safer? Was she a serial offender, or a desperate survivor who lashed out in moments of fear? Third, Betty's case forces us to consider the role of gender in the death penalty. Fewer than 20 women have been executed since 1976, compared to thousands of men. Women who kill are often judged not only for their crimes, but for violating social expectations of femininity, motherhood, and care. Did Betty face harsher judgment because she was seen as a woman who betrayed those roles? Or was she treated equally in a system that claims gender neutrality? Fourth, her appeals highlight the unforgiving rigidity of habeas corpus law in Texas. Even when judges recognize failures in her trial, procedural technicalities slam the door on relief. Supporters ask, should deadlines and paperwork outweigh evidence that might have saved a life? Critics argue that finality is necessary for justice, but in Betty's case, it meant her abuse story was never heard in court. Finally, there is the broader moral question: what should justice mean in cases shaped by trauma? If someone commits murder after a lifetime of violence and abuse, should that history be part of the judgment? Should it change the outcome? Or does a grave in the yard erase all sympathy? Nearly 25 years after her execution, Betty Lou Beets' case is still taught in law schools, debated by advocacy groups, and remembered by true crime followers. It lingers not because the facts are in dispute, but because the meaning is. From the moment Jimmy Don's boat was found drifting on Lake Athens to the night Betty Lou Beets lay strapped to a gurney in Huntsville, this story spans nearly 2 decades of mystery, crime, trial, and punishment. It is the story of a little girl scarred by abuse, who became a woman trapped in violent marriages, who buried 2 husbands in her own yard, and who ultimately faced the state's most final punishment. To some, she was exactly what the headlines called her: the Black Widow of Texas, a manipulative killer who married for security and killed for money. To others, she was a battered woman whose cries for help were ignored, condemned to die not just for her crimes, but for a lifetime of suffering. The truth lies somewhere in between, or perhaps it will never be fully known. But what remains undeniable is this: her case forces us to ask the hardest questions about crime, punishment, and mercy. When the state holds the power to end a life, how much history should matter? How much trauma should weigh against guilt? And when justice demands an answer, what does true fairness really look like? So now I'll leave the question to you. Should Betty Lou Beets have been executed, or should her life have been spared? If this story challenged the way you think about justice, make sure to like this video, share it with someone who follows true crime, and subscribe so you don't miss the next story that asks the questions we can't afford to ignore. Because in the end, the search for answers never really stops.